Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to join you today. And we have a very exciting package for you in terms of the material to help you navigate the regulatory framework within the region. As has been said by Jehoshaphat, I will be talking about regulatory and licensing requirements for the Zambian environment, and then Joshua will take over from me, and he will get also into some detail on some aspects of the Zambian regulatory environment. As has been said, this is the second session that we're having. The first one was on IPP project finance, and now we're dealing with the regulatory aspects. The basic objective is to give our IPP and developers within Zambia and the region a clear understanding of how to navigate developing projects within the country and the region as a whole. So it's important that you get a clear picture of how we navigate or how you bring a project to a level where it is recognized by the regulators in the particular jurisdictions that you will be interested in operating, whether it is in Zambia, Zimbabwe, or South Africa. In session one, we're even giving you an overview of some of the areas where GreenCo operates. It's in Zambia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, South Africa. We have entities there, and we have a good understanding of what the lay of the land is in terms of regulatory compliance. But without much ado, we're going to get into the presentation. So in terms of the landscape of the Zambian environmental, or rather the Zambian regulatory environment, we're going to cover the areas of where it is coming from. I'll give you some background so that you understand when I start to refer to changes and migration, you have a clear picture of where we're coming from, and then can appreciate what is happening now in terms of what changes have happened and what you can take advantage of in terms of project development. From a politics perspective, we in Zambia migrated from an environment where it was an economy that was controlled by government, and all aspects of the economy policy from environment in terms of business in the country towards a more private sector driven economy. And that then later manifested into policies which were meant to change the regulatory environment. Prior to or immediately after the change in the political landscape in 1994, we had our first major policy shift, which consolidated the various aspects of energy regulation in the country into one policy that would guide the country forward in terms of the growth and development of the energy sector. This gave rise to the first consolidated energy laws that we have, or we had in Zambia, the Energy Regulation Act and the Electricity Act of 1995. This principally brought or continued, I would say, the single buyer model that revolved around a single or a principal national utility that was controlling the whole sector, a vertically integrated utility. So it covered generation, transmission, distribution, and all aspects. But in that era, it also had some regulatory functions. But after the change in 1991, it was felt a separate and independent regulator was required. And that was what was brought in. A new regulator was created to handle the regulation, whereas the ministry or the government handled the policy issues, and then the utility focused just on the development and the management of the power sector. In 2008, there were further amendments to the same law that was passed in 95. This was to increase the participation, or the objective was to increase the participation of the private sector, whereas the national utility still continued. It was not privatized or unbundled, but the private sector was given space within which to operate. Presently, we are under the 2019 energy policy, and this brought in a new set of regulatory provisions, the Electricity Act and the Energy Regulation Act of 2019. This has further taken the Zambian energy sector to another level of increasing the participation of the private sector. And we will get into those in greater detail, and you will see exactly what these laws have brought about. In terms of polity, the regulatory environment, the institutional framework, what is the landscape now? We still have a national utility which has been commercialized and not privatized. It was previously operating under a separate act of parliament, but it has been put under the Companies Act to sort of signal the migration towards commercialization and operating on commercial principles and not just providing a service like a department of government. We also have, as I said, had an independent regulator whose powers have been enhanced further by the new regulations. We have an office for promoting private power investments, which is meant to assist project developers and projects navigate the regulatory environment in an expeditious ways. Then also the national utility, although not yet or has not been unbundled, it has been commercialized, as I said, and also has been regulated under key performance indicators managed by the Energy Regulation Board. Because it has no competitor in the country, it was felt they needed to be guided in a manner which would encourage them to improve their efficiencies and operations. So in terms of the significant changes that I will get into shortly, we've seen a migration from the single buyer model to a model where there isn't monopolization by a utility, where ZESCO, in our case, had the central role. We're now in a willing buyer, willing seller model. There are multiple players in the sector, which I will show you what types of enterprises the laws now allow a trade, an enterprise or an investor to get into, spanning from generation right up to trading, supply, and distribution. My colleague Joshua will also talk to you about the open access regime and other new developments such as the net metering. So I will not get into those. So I'll let him cover that. So in terms of just giving you a better background in terms of what has happened after the 2019 energy policy, this replaced the 2008 policy, and the main objective was really to deal with the energy mix. In terms of the electricity sector, this implies less reliance on hydro. 2024 is not the first time that we have faced a significant drought in the Southern African region. This has happened before, and it was predicted that it would happen again, and the risk was seen. Where Zambia was almost 99% dependent on hydro, the effects of climate change were recognized, and there was now a move towards diversifying the energy mix to bring about some climate resilience within the sector. So the policy that was then passed also addressed the reliance on just one national utility. So there was a move towards promoting private sector involvement by creating an office for promoting private power investment, changing the laws to facilitate for the private sector to come in and signal to the investors that there's an open door to investing in the energy sector in the country. The laws and regulations that have been promulgated have at the core of it a desire to want to create a framework which is transparent and also allows for clear market rules to be seen by everybody, and then allow for developments to come through. The main objective is to increase investments, to allow for more power coming off the grid, and also a robust energy market to develop within the country. What has been achieved thus far, following the launch of the 2019 policy, is passing of the Energy Regulation Act and the Electricity Act in 2019, which both came into effect in 2020. And this year, in 2024, there's been the passing of the open access regulations, net metering regulations, and also in November 2023, the government approved the integrated resource plan for the country. It was launched in 2024 to signal the direction that the government wanted to see the Zambian energy sector develop towards. So there are a number of programs which are still in development that are meant to actualize the objectives of the energy policy and fulfill the provisions of the law that has been passed. But the takeaway from here is that Zambia no longer operates a single buyer model, but a willing buyer, willing seller model. And that's what really has attracted a lot of attention from the private sector because of these signals that are being put out by government. So what does that look like? In terms of the principal legislation that we have in the country, as I said, we have the Electricity Act, the Energy Regulation Act, and other regulations which are then supporting the migration towards a more market-driven energy sector. The Electricity Act lists the different types of enterprises one can get into within Zambia, from generation, transmission, both at transmission voltages as well as the distribution networks. There's a system operator, the independent system operator to come into the market to be able to provide an independent oversight of the transmission and distribution network. There's intermediaries, traders who have been facilitated by the law to provide for those that can buy and sell power from generators to customers without necessarily limiting an IPP to sell their power to the national. How to deal with imports and exports on bilateral, multilateral contracts, as opposed to regional spot market trades. That has been differentiated. And there are also other functions of the national regulator, which have and also a role to superintend agreement between parties to ensure that the tariff principles and the guiding principles in the Act are being followed. In terms of the Energy Regulation Act, what has really come out is the continuation of the independent regulator, enhancing the functions of the regulator, making it clear what the functions of the regulators board are as separate from the secretariat, and make sure that it is clear for all to be able to know how to interact with the regulator and also enhance its powers in some respects. It has also brought in the licensing process, and I believe this is of greater interest to you developers, how to navigate the licensing process within the country, and I will be getting into more details in relation to this. So in terms of what the law intends to achieve, this is the ideal situation. This is what the law wants to achieve in Zambia, where you have increased production, transmission that is able to carry the capacity of the power generated and being traded or being consumed in the country. A power exchange that will allow for open trading, where there would be transparency in the market, and actually have a functioning market, which would allow for buying and selling of power, the development of projects, and also where there's price discovery for the power that right now that is not very you don't know what power is in solar, in hydro, wind, and other sectors, because these are contained in power purchase agreements or power supply agreements that are essentially confidential and are not open for the market to know what is prevailing in terms of what is being sold on the market. So this is what the government would like to achieve. Thus far, we do have independent power producers who are available in the market. Not many. There's a system operator, but it is not independent yet. It is still managed by the national utility. There is also transmission system operators, both operated by the private sector and the national utility. So it is not fully privatized, or there's limited scope for the private sector in this, in terms of distribution and supply. Something is for to also enter power from different points. Power distributors, we do have a few distributors, but this is in very limited circumstances. There are quite a few off-grid power distributors, but that is on a very small scale, and I'm not really focusing on the independent power producers, although perhaps in the question and answer session, if you have very specific questions on that, we can delve into that. But most of what we're focusing on is on grid and meeting the demand for the grid. We don't yet have market operators and national exchanges that are independent, that are able to carry out these functions of superintending over the energy market in Zambia. We do have a regional exchange in the Southern African region, which most of you are aware of, the Southern African Power Pool. We did touch on this during the time that we were looking at session 1. This presents a further opportunity for the developers within Zambia and across the region, because we now have a willing buyer, willing model in Zambia. You can develop a power plant with the intention to sell to a customer within Zambia, or to sell it on the regional market. We don't yet have an exclusive Zambian market that an exchange similar to what, or at the level that you see it in other jurisdictions, but we're migrating, or the government wants to migrate towards that. So there is a regional exchange which presents opportunities for merchant power plants to be developed with some customers in Zambia and also within the region. You could have a customer in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, or across the region and trade across the region using the interconnected system. So there are also traders and aggregators within the Zambian space, and GreenCo is one such trader and aggregator that has come onto the market to provide an alternative to the model we had before, where you had a single buyer, which was the national utility. Now you have multiple buyers within the region. So an IPP does not have to sell all its power to the national utility if it wishes to trade only with the private sector. That is possible. You can sell your power to a trader such as GreenCo and get to that power, get to different customers. The buyer doesn't have to buy its power only from ZESCO, but it can do so also from the private sector. And GreenCo brings in a different model, which if you wish, in the answer and question session, we'll talk to you a little bit more about that. We have spoken at length about GreenCo in session 1, so some are aware of what services we are able to offer in this space as an intermediary and trader. But that gives you a flavor of the different types of enterprises that can be incorporated or established within Zambia. So how do you enter the Zambian market? If you want to just get a general view or an overview of the power sector and the regulatory steps and the entities you will need to interact with, the Ministry of Energy has published a compendium of the agencies and authorities that you may have to deal with in order to get your operations going in Zambia. But what the compendium doesn't do is to go further to explain how you actually how you process your licenses in detail. It just gives you an overview what each agency does, what its mandate is. So it is a good start to understand the lay of the land in Zambia in one documentation, to be able to know what you would be required to do. But as I said, what it doesn't do is then tell you how to navigate the licensing per se, in terms of perhaps a single licensing system or the navigation with the ERB and how the interplay between these agencies are. So that is found in the Zambia Power Development Framework, which outlines this. Now, in terms of how you begin, I will be using an example of an enterprise that wants to develop a physical infrastructure. Some of this would not apply for enterprises such as an intermediary or a trader who does not have to build infrastructure. So the examples would be tailored towards the infrastructure development, because we're dealing with capacity building for IPPs. The first stage in the Zambian space is to apply for feasibility study rights. Now, the significance of a feasibility study right is that it gives you exclusivity to a particular site within the country, whether it is a point along a water body, a waterfall, a rapid, or a piece of land which is close to an off-take point for a solar, or a place where there's good wind studies done. You get exclusivity through the feasibility study right that is given, which is valid for 2 years, and thereafter you have an opportunity to renew it for another year if it is clear or clearly explained to the ministry why the feasibility study report could not be concluded within the 2 years, such as what we had in 2020, up to 2022, where there were delays due to COVID and certain studies could not be done in a manner that developers wanted to do. So that is a clear example of a situation like that. Once you have a feasibility study report and a feasibility study right, you would then use that 2-year period to develop a detailed study which would enable you to go into issues of land ownership, environmental studies, connection points, and also confirm whether the expectation of the power you were intending to generate from that site can indeed be achieved or not. So that then leads us into the environmental study. This is superintended by the Zambia Environmental Management Agency, and you would need to do an environmental impact study. There are 2 levels of that, and we'll get into that in a moment. Once the Zambia Environmental Management Agency gives you the go-ahead, that becomes an input into getting a construction permit from the Energy Regulation Board, and also getting other permits from other institutions. Like I mentioned, in the Zambia Power Development Frameworks, those institutions are outlined, such as the Water Resources Management, if you're developing a hydro project, and the National Heritage Conservation Commission, which looks after all waterfalls within the country, where they're also dealing with the Ministry of Lands, local government, local communities, ZESCO in terms of grid studies, and so on. And also your interactions with possible off-takers. That's the period in which you would develop these documentation for a further discussion with the Ministry of Energy in terms of getting an implementation agreement signed. What does the implementation agreement entail? It is an agreement with government to just outline what the project would get, what are the expectations, a restating of government's position on matters such as appropriation in events of political unrest and so on. How is the government going to support the project? This is then going to lead into the final stage of getting an operational license from the ERB, which also incorporates your agreements or approvals with the possible or potential off-takers for the tariffs and power purchase agreements or power supply agreements. So in an overview, that's the steps you would have to go through: feasibility study, environmental studies, a collection and a study of various aspects of the project to satisfy different regulatory agencies in order to get their permits, and then lead you into signing an implementation agreements and getting the actual operation or operational license. That is important for your financing, because financiers will want to see that you have completed all internal regulatory steps, and this is evidenced by you producing an operational license or producing other permits, such as an environmental permit. Now, as I said, there are some pre-permit or pre-license phases, which are controlled by the Ministry of Energy through some of its departments and some other institutions. As I said, you will have to develop a feasibility study rights through the Office for Promoting Private Power Investments. They would guide you into the nature of the study, even giving you a template of the feasibility report, what goes into the report itself, what information you have to provide, and then the reporting frequencies as you develop your feasibility study over the 2-year period, or 3-year if you have been given permission to extend. And the rest of the steps, I think I have already highlighted these, that once you developed or you have a clear picture in terms of your feasibility reports. This would lead you into your EIA, understanding of the economic viability of your project, discussions with your potential off-takers or potential customers, also then attracting funders with the knowledge that you now have, or there is a collection of potential buyers for the power from your project site. So these are the steps that are highlighted above, just restating that. Now, in terms of the environmental impact assessment, this is one of the major hurdles that you will face as a project developer. It would be a hurdle if you don't plan for it or you don't plan for it well. If a project developer attempts to do this right at the stage when they are, they've already finished your feasibility studies and you now want to attract your financiers, and then you are guided by the environmental regulator, it would appear as if they were standing in the way of your project implementation. So some of these things they need to be done well in advance or alongside the time that you are doing your feasibility study. The process is quite elaborate. There are two types of environmental approvals you need to get. An environmental project brief, as the name suggests. These are smaller projects which do not have very significant environmental impact, such as a small solar plant, as opposed to a major hydro project, which would demand, that would have a greater environmental footprint. There are also issues of resettlement. If your project might be small, but it might involve resettling people. So it might be migrated from a project brief to a full environmental study. And the details of this is that there's a requirement for scoping studies to be done, and you develop your draft environmental project document, you submit it to guide you whether they've done this is to avoid a situation where you submit your documents and you start waiting for an approval only to be told there are various aspects of your projects that is not fully complete or attended to. Then they would take it for public comments as well as comments from other regulators. And then you would get a consolidated decision through ZEMA in a decision letter, whether it is an approval with conditions or without condition, or a rejection. But in any case, they would give you clear indications of what has come out of your environmental process. With the ARB, or the energy regulation body, the licensing process is a step further after you have your environmental approval. It is an input into a license, and the regulations and the laws require that you would have done your environmental assessments. For those enterprises, that will require physical infrastructure. I restate that because if you are intending to be a trader and an intermediary, you definitely do not need an environmental impact study. So you would then use your environmental impact study people understanding and expressing the regulators to see and assess whether you actually do have a potential project. What they aim to avoid is giving licenses to entities who will just be speculating. You don't have a project, you don't really have potential customers, and they just give you a license and you just sit on the records or on the books that you are a project developer, but there's no actual project that is being developed. So that they try to avoid through that process of ensuring that they actually see potential offtake agreements and also see other permits that you have gone through in terms of construction permissions, zoning permissions from the other organizations like the municipalities and so on. Then they would issue a license with conditions, and that license deals with payments for license fees and other compliance requirements when you submit your reports, the frequency of inspections, and how you then operate within the market is guided by the conditions within the license. That, I think, is the gist of the licensing process within Zambia, and I will then hand over to my colleague Joshua to take you through. He will go into detail, and as was mentioned earlier, Joshua is a seasoned legal practitioner in Zambia. He has worked on various projects in the energy space and infrastructure projects to guide developers so as to help them navigate the regulatory environment. So over to you, Joshua. He will talk about open access, and whether you have questions, you can post them in the group, and we will try and address them as we go along. We've already started to receive some questions, and which we'll address in the question and answer session. So if there are some questions from what I've presented and what Joshua will present, please do put them in the question and answer, and we'll attempt to address them. So Joshua, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brian, and for laying the good foundation. I'll be kind of going back to some of the points you are highlighting, just to emphasize the points on open access. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'll be kind of zeroing in on this aspect of open access, and this arises from the fact of where we're coming from in the country and where we intend to be, or what we think the ideal position for the energy market should be. So one of the points Brian touched on is that we've moved from this aspect of single buyer, but now we're looking at the aspect of willing seller and willing buyer, right? But for that to work, certain things must be in place. And one of the aspects or conditions which must be in place for you to have that competitive energy market is an aspect of open access. Okay. Brian, who's moving the slides?
We'll move them from here.
All right. If I can ask you, can you go back to, I think, the slide 9? Amongst your slide, I think slide 9. Where you had different players. Yes, just there. All right. So ideally, this is how your sector would be. You've got a producer there, a transmitter, and then eventually you've got your customers, right? But if you're going to produce, someone else may own the transmission infrastructure, and your customer definitely may not have that infrastructure. So you can produce, but you need to find someone to buy. And you can find someone to buy, but how do you deliver the energy you've produced to them? You need that infrastructure, which can be transmission or the distribution infrastructure. So what open access now is saying is that you need to provide access to qualifying participants on a non-discriminatory basis. So in other words, anyone who is eligible or qualifies to have access to the transmission infrastructure, they should be given that access. What that would do is that you do not want to, simply because, for instance, you're dealing with this mine company, and because the state has got an interest, you give them preferential conditions. While another private sector, you don't want to do that. So ideally, that's not what open access wants. Open access wants that everyone who's qualifying, who qualifies, should be given access on a non-discriminatory basis. Okay. Okay, we can go to my slides now, Brian. Okay, just there. All right. So I started by open access by just stating, so what is this open access? As I indicated, the goal is to ensure that qualifying generators traders or electricity consumers, they've got access to the transmission or distribution network, and that access should be given on terms and conditions which are not discriminatory. Okay. Once you achieve that, the objective you're going to derive is that you're going to facilitate competition amongst different generators or producers, IPP, as well as also with consumers. And then ultimately you're going to have efficiency in your market because of that competition. So other than that, the other point which open access would provide to the sector is this aspect of encouraging investment in the sector. Okay, by way of practical example, dealing with a single buyer is that you may not have that negotiation, or even if you've negotiated, what if there are issues with that single buyer? It means your project cannot go through. Okay, from what we see here in practice is that developer will come. When you ask them who's your intended off-taker, they'll mention ZESCO. Okay, but when you go to ZESCO, there are other people also interested to sell power to ZESCO. So the project may not move at the pace you want it to move, right? But with open access, what that entails now is that you don't have to go just to one buyer. You can go to any person who's willing to buy that power. And the law should allow you, give you that access to use someone else's infrastructure to deliver power to your off-taker. Okay. Another point which open access would bring, or what the objective is, I think it's the issue of mitigating the credit risk. Okay. I'll place again the ZESCO example. So most of the projects are not taking off because the proposed off-taker is ZESCO. And when you go to the financiers, they'll be looking at, okay, in the event your off-taker does not pay, what free cost is there? Are they going to pay for the power you'll be giving them? Or if they don't, what are the alternatives? So those are some of questions you'll be asked, and you need to resolve them in order for the project to take off. So one of the objectives of open access is just to assist in mitigating this credit risk. As opposed to relying on one off-taker, you can rely on multiple ones. I think Brian had touched on the aspect of aggregators. Yeah. So that is how that can come in. Okay. So the market is reforming in Zambia, as Brian, I think, did a good job kind of showing us where we're coming from and where we're going. And definitely it was realized that one of the points which needs to be kind of properly regulated is an aspect of open access. Yeah. So 2019, the Electricity Act had a provision which recognizes this aspect of open access, and then even defines open access in the same lines as providing access to qualifying participants on a non-discriminatory terms or conditions. Okay, but that was our enabling provision. But we needed more detailed rules and regulations in terms of how do you make an application, what type of conditions should be attached, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this year those regulations were passed, and those were the open access regulations of 2014. They kind of expand on Section 14 of the Electricity Act, which deals with open access. Okay, next slide. So for you to have access to a transmission system or distribution system, you need to be eligible to participate as an open access user. So the first requirement is that you must be licensed by the Energy Regulation Board. Okay, Brian talked about the different players in the market and the different licenses which you can get. So if you are one of those who's licensed, definitely you'll be eligible to be an open access user. The regulations also kind of place a certain threshold on the type of users. So if you're a trader of power, you need to be a trader with a capacity of at least 1 megawatt and above. If you're a producer of power, you're an IPP, you need to be producing at least, again, 1 megawatt of power and above. And then if you're a consumer, you're willing to buy from different players, again, you should have the consumption of 1 megawatt and above. Okay. The regulations also further go on to categorize the different types of open access users, okay, and in 3 categories. So they're looking at the short term, open access, medium term, and long term. So short term is where now you're looking just for less than 3 months, and then medium term between 3 months and 5 years, and then long term where you've got access for more than 5 years. So you must be licensed. You must be producing, trading, producing, or consuming power of at least 1 megawatts and above. And then you must now indicate what duration are you looking to have access to the grid. Okay. The regulations also go on kind of in detail in terms of the application process of what you need to do. The application itself is in a standard form. It prescribes the information which you need to submit. It also provides room for the network system provider or a distribution network service provider to ask for more information. So when you're making this application for access, you're making an application to the owner of the infrastructure. So if the person is the one who operates the network, the transmission network system network, you are making an application to them. If someone is one in charge of the distribution network system, you make an application to them. Okay. So again, the regulation provides a timeline within which that application need to be approved. Other than that, specific considerations which must be taken into account have also been prescribed. The main one is the issue to do with capacity. So if the transmission network, the system is maxed out, it's full to capacity, your application will be rejected because there's no point accepting something when they will not accommodate you. The whole concept of open access is that you should be given access if there's availability on the network. But if the network is full, that's a basis upon which your application may be rejected. The regulation also takes into account that the network may be full, may be maxed out, but if certain strengthening are made to the system, room may be created. That can also be added as part of the condition where the system is strengthened so that more capacity can be accommodated on the system. So other than that, the other thing to factor in is the aspect of financial capacity. As I'll show later on, there's an obligation for you to make a deposit so that it kind of acts as a security for some of your obligations by being an open access user. So that comes with a financial implication. So you'll be assessed on the basis of your financial capacity. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So what happens if there are multiple people applying for access using the same line? Okay, again, that has been factored in the regulations. So in terms of priority is given to a participant who's looking for access to a system, transmission or distribution, and the objective of that participant is to help with meeting the demand or ensuring that there's an aspect of security of supply within the grid, the Zambian grid. Those will be given priority. Other than that, the priority now follows on the aspect of someone who's looking to have the long-term access. They'll be given priority, followed by medium-term access. The short-term access, they're at the bottom in terms of the priority. But nonetheless, I think the regulations are trying to accommodate an aspect of first come, first serve. Okay. But nonetheless, if they're multiple, they will have to take into account your different tenure. So definitely those who are looking for long-term tenure are like to be given priority. But other than that, should someone need to have access to the system for purposes of meeting demand or ensuring security of supply within the grid, they'll also be given that. Okay. The other key aspect to note about open access is an aspect of you're going to use someone else's infrastructure, and that should not come for free. A payment must be made. A levy is charged for that. So in terms of a levy, again, it's about the willing parties. What the network system provider charges is what would go. Okay. But again, the thinking here is that that fee should be something which is cost effective of the cost incurred by the system operator. Okay. The network, the owner of the infrastructure. The other aspect you have to make note of, similarly like a power purchase agreement, the regulator approves those charges. So the regulator will review and approve the charges. Okay. going back to the system, the concept of that the terms and conditions should be on a non-discriminatory basis. Okay, so it's very important that whatever fee you charge to one user, it should be applicable to all the users. Okay, so under the regulations, the ERB has also been empowered to kind of provide some form of model, some form of pricing methodology to be used, so that at least there's a bit of predictability and certainty, but more importantly, that everyone is charged the same fee. So those are some of the provisions, the regulations to do with tariffs. Okay, next slide. Okay, so once you've been given that access, you'll now be allowed to use the system for purpose of trading the energy you're producing, or for purpose of you buying that. So the regulations have kind of specified what you need to tick in order for you to be fully integrated as an open access user. So we've talked about you making an application to a transmission network service provider or a distribution network service provider. So one of the things you need to have proof that you've been given that access, okay? And then secondly, what it's being anticipated within the sector is that you are an open access user, you've got the owner of the infrastructure, and then we've got another player, Brian touched on this, a system operator. Okay, the one now will be in charge of all the systems to see that there's a bit of integrity and everything is going as it should. Okay, so again, now you need to have another form of agreement, what is called a balancing agreement with a system operator. Okay, and then if you've got a power purchase supply agreement, that has to be registered with the system operator as well. The idea here is that the system operator at least should have information in terms of anyone who's using that information. And you don't want just to apply for purpose of having access to the network when you don't even have an agreement to supply power or to sell power. So that kind of comes in handy. And then also, there's an aspect, as I indicated, of you providing some form of financial security. So this is to cover costs to do with the system imbalances and so on and so forth. So that's something which also needs to be factored in. Okay, so the point here is that you being given up your application to a network service provider, transmission network service provider being approved, that's not it. You also have to deal now with a system operator. Okay, and again, even after you've been given that access, in the event the system is having some form of operational constraint and something has to be done by the system operator in order to maintain the integrity of the system, they're allowed to curtail certain power. And in terms of how that is done, they start with the short-term open access users. They can curtail power from you, followed by medium-term, and then finally by long-term users. So that is within the control of the system operator. Can be given access, but for purpose of protecting the integrity of the system, certain measures have been put in the regulations. Okay, next slide. Okay, so briefly touching on the key law players here of who deal with open access. One of the key players for this open access is the system operator, and Brian touched on this aspect. So because they're the ones now in charge of the grid as the system operator, they're required to have some form of guidelines. Again, here it's an issue of predictability, certainty, and ensuring that everyone plays by the same rules. But those guidelines have to be approved by the ARB. Okay, so once you are an open access user, you'll be dealing with transactions. A number of transactions will be happening on the system. Okay, and then in terms of scheduling those transactions, that is a responsibility of the system operator. Okay, and then more importantly, also monitoring compliance of open access. That again is a responsibility of the system operator. Okay, other than that, you've got the ARB. The ARB, I think that's a regulator, as Brian had indicated, for the whole sector. So the fact that you've got a system operator doesn't mean ARB has been excluded. They are part of that as well. So in terms of enforcing and developing any additional guidelines, that's the responsibility of the ARB. They are approving the tariffs, which should be charged by any person who owns an infrastructure, be it a transmission network or distribution network. ARB needs to approve that. But other than that, as I indicated, they are mandated to develop the pricing methodology for fees so that it's easy to predict how much you'll be charged should you want to use another person's infrastructure. Okay. So other than the regulations, under the Act, with respect to open access, the ARB also has a mandate to resolve any disputes to do with open access. So, for instance, if you've applied for access and then you've been denied, and you think they still, the reasons are unjustified, you can apply to ARB for them to resolve that dispute. Alternatively, it's been approved, but the conditions are stringent or there's some onerous. You can apply to the ARB and ask the ARB to try and resolve those disputes. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So enacted in 2014, I think about 2-3 months ago. So there are certain things which need to be put in place in order for the open access regulations to be fully effective. So before the open access regime, there are other transactions which have already been agreements, which are already in place. So those will continue until they expire. But other than that, the other transitional provision is that the system operator is required to submit operational guidelines to the ARB for approval, which are very key for the effective operations of the regulations. So those are some of the transitional provisions as we now move to the full implementation of the open access regime. Okay, next slide. Just a commentary now in terms of the impact. I did touch this when I was looking at the objective, but just to emphasize the point of why this aspect is very important and why it has to work, especially for the sector in Zambia. Definitely is an aspect of increased competition. If you're able to produce power and have a number of sellers who you are willing to sell to, you are definitely going to get a better price and gives you that good negotiating power. Definitely an increase in investment, because if you're going to produce power, the first thing financiers ask, who is your off-taker? So at least if you have got multiple off-takers or options of different multiple off-takers, I think that will also be good for the sector. With open access, there also is this emphasis that it will help with the integration of renewable energy project. So that's something we need to see. Improved efficiency and grid management. The idea is that if you've got this system operator who's independent and effective, the whole system eventually can benefit from that. And ultimately, the whole sector benefit. Okay, as I conclude, I can look at the brief challenges. All good things, but definitely there's some challenges which need to be ironed out in order for us to have an effective open access regime in Zambia. Next slide. So the biggest challenge is that if you apply for access and the infrastructure is maxed out, there's nothing, your application will be rejected. Or it may be that in the area where your project is, someone already has got access over that that network. It means you cannot rely on the open access regime. So there's a recognition that definitely the infrastructure may need to be upgraded in order to accommodate a number of projects which are becoming online. Okay. I read somewhere saying the capacity to enforce these regulations may also be one of the challenges you point out, but I think that's a kind of a low challenge which can be easily mitigated. Time needed for market participants to adjust. There are some now who are hearing about this for the first time, trying to understand how it's going to play. The players who are already there in the market, how do they adjust to allowing someone else to use their network and so on and so forth. So those are some of the things which participants need to be aware of. For me, I'm thinking I think this discussion started about 2012, somewhere there, about open access. So it's been going on. Even before the enactment of the Electricity Act, there was this recognition that there should be this aspect of open access in order for the energy market in Zambia to develop. And then coming in on GreenCo as an intermediary player, I think that also has helped to show that it's possible. You may not own the infrastructure, but you may give it that infrastructure. So that challenge also, I think, may be dealt with sooner. A clear transmission pricing methodology, I think that's very important because it helps with the predictability and certainty and ensuring that the price which you pay is what is not discriminatory. Yeah, but the biggest elephant in the room, I think Brian touched on this, is an aspect of establishing an independent system operator. Okay, currently that role resides with ZESCO. So some may say there's an aspect of bias because ZESCO is also a generator, also sells power. So it's kind of involved in multiple roles. So I think we'll see how that will be done for ZESCO, but definitely for the aspect of open access to work, there is need to have an independent system operator. Okay, I think that is usually a key requirement for open access. So those are my challenges, I think, to implementation, which needs to be ironed out in order for the Zambian energy sector with respect to open access to be fully implemented. Okay, I think, Brian, that's the end of my slide.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joshua. That was a very insightful presentation. I do invite you to look at some of the questions that were being posted in the comments while you were speaking. I know you couldn't respond there and then, but if you could do so now, some of the questions were posted. We've tried to answer some of them, but maybe you could also give your perspective on some of these issues. One of the questions that stood out is, do you have to only can you deal with CEC as well if you want to export power to the DRC, for example? Do you have to enter into an agreement with CEC? So perhaps you can touch on that, as well as if you want to move power from one part of the country to another, what's the modality for that?
All right, thanks, Brian. I can touch on that. So the open access regulations, I think, are applicable to all entities operating in Zambia. And here we're looking at someone who owns a transmission infrastructure or distribution infrastructure. So on the Copper Belt, CEC definitely owns those transmission infrastructure. So if you want to wheel your power all the way to DRC, it means you need to apply to CEC for them to give you access to their transmission system. Okay, and even them now, they have to follow the provisions provided for under the regulations. They'll have to subject you to the same requirement prescribed under the regulations. So, and one of the things for them, I'm sure, for most of these owners of the transmission network or distribution network is capacity. Is there capacity or not? If there's capacity, they should allow you to do that. Yeah. So the key here is that, do you qualify? Are you a licensed entity? Is there capacity on the system? Do you have the financial capacity? If you tick all those boxes, they definitely should be able to give you that power. Okay. If, for instance, your project is so on this side of the country, say Southern Province or Lusaka, it means you have to deal with ZESCO and then CEC, because those are now different owners of the different infrastructures. So what the regulations even is that you need to make an application to the transmission network service provider. The owner of the transmission network is the one you make an application to. Okay, Brian.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joshua. I think that was an amazing presentation, and of course, there's still some more questions going on in the Q&A.
All right, I'll try to respond to those I can.
The Q&A and And I would like to introduce our next presenter, Röhrs. Just give me my screen. Yes, so Sue is going to cover. Oh, hello, Sue. Hi. Yeah, she's going to cover the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act in SA, and of course, Sue is an incredible person. I've had a chance to meet her, and she's incredible for bringing to the table vast amount of experience. So 5 years of experience in private practice, Southern Africa Department, direct industry. She advises a broad range of clients, industry entities, and business associations on energy-related matters, law and policy developments, having been a member of the NEDLAC business delegation engaging on the South African Integrated Resource Plan and the Electricity Regulation Act Amendment Bill, which has now been signed into law, which I think is incredible. She's very familiar with the law, regulation, policy, and planning documents pertaining to electricity in South Africa, both current and contemplated, and has engaged extensively with clients and with South African government in regards. And so it is really such a pleasure to have you, Sue, joining us for this session of our webinars. And I think without taking too much of your time, I'll just let you maybe give a brief introduction and also just take us through your segment. Thank you.
Thanks so very much, Josephat. Do you mind if I continue then?
Please, you can continue from here.
Thanks very much. So if you would, that's wonderful. Such a pleasure to be on this panel, and thank you very much for having me. Exciting to see the developments that are going on throughout the continent, and it's wonderful to see that from the previous speakers and the presentations that the markets are opening up, and that we're seeing open access, we're seeing competition, and certainly that's the move in South Africa as well. South Africa's had the Electricity Regulation Act, which was passed into law in 2006. This is possibly going to be quite a technical presentation, because the way that I've done it is to take people through the actual amendments section by section. But what I intend doing actually is, whilst I deal with the various sections, is talk more to the overarching regulatory framework in South Africa. And because there's so much that's happening at the moment, it might be difficult to touch on it all. But what we're seeing is quite a dynamic space. And one of the more exciting things that's happening is this Electricity Regulation Amendment Act, which was signed into law by the president recently, but is not yet effective. So it'll become effective on a date to be determined by the presidency. And then I'm not sure if it's Brian or Jehoshaphat who's driving the slides, but if we could just go straight into it with the next slide, and then I'll speak to the market in general as I talk to the sections. Okay, so sorry, I'm just sorting myself out here. I've got too many screens open. So as I said, the Cyril Ramaphosa, the South African president, has signed the ERA Amendment Act into law. And one of the things that happens, I don't know if it happens in other countries on the continent, but we use acronyms a lot in this industry. So if I start talking about the ERA, I'm referring to the Electricity Regulation Act of 2006, which has been previously amended, but the new amendments are mainly to give effect to really the unbundling of Eskom. So the national utility is Eskom, which is currently operating by way of transmission, distribution, and generation division. So when I say currently operating, the transmission division has recently been segued off, and the National Transmission Company of South Africa, SAC Limited, so the NTCSA, is a subsidiary of Eskom Holdings, but is a separate company. So the transmission activities of Eskom are being hived off into the NTCSA, and I'll get to that more shortly. At the moment, we've still got Eskom Distribution and Eskom Generation, which are sitting under Eskom Holdings. And if you look at this act or the amendment to the act, most of it is to give effect to the unbundling effectively of the utility Eskom in South Africa, and to make provision for a proposed opening of a competitive wholesale electricity market, to give effect to a market code which will arise under that, and then to make provision for various functions in the NTCSA, so the transmission entity, including the market operator, which will enforce effectively compliance and run the market code, the central purchasing agency, which is an entity which will really fill the role, if you will, of the old single buyer, the transmission services provider, so the transmission entity which is going to run the physical infrastructure of the grid, and the system operator, which looks at balancing and ensuring reliability of the grid. And that's dealt with quite comprehensively in amendments to the Act. Maybe if we can go to the next slide, and then I'll just talk to how this is intended to happen. So, I mean, what I've done here is I've put most of the amendments into this this presentation. So it's quite a technical presentation, but if you don't mind, I'll talk to what they do. There's a new section 2 which takes certain provisions of the old Act out of the functioning of this Act, and what they do is, if you look at the structure of the South African electricity industry under the ERA pre this 2024 amendment, you'll find that the way that NERSA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, the regulator in South Africa, regulated the electricity supply and distribution industries in South Africa was by way of licenses and license conditions, and by way of registrations. And there was a move recently. When I say recently, I mean it started in about the original Electricity Regulation Act had an exemption schedule. So it had a schedule in terms of which if you qualified under the exemption schedule, then you didn't have to license. But there was a renewed focus on this exemption schedule starting from about 2018, 2019, in terms of which there was a move which came about via a couple of amendments to this exemption schedule, so that certain categories of activities that were required to be licensed under the ERA no longer had to be licensed as long as they complied with the exemption schedule. So what we found was that there was a move, and you'll find that in South African terminology, there'll be reference to Schedule 2 of the ERA, and this is the exemption schedule. The exemption schedule talks to exemptions in relation to generation, certain categories of distribution, certain categories of trading. And what has happened in certainly the last version of the exemption schedule was in January of 2023, and effectively under that, most categories of generation no longer require licensing, as long as they comply with certain things like the network and codes, or the transmission and distribution suite of codes in South Africa. So you'll find that just generally in South African in the South African industry, licenses are currently required for generation, transmission, distribution, import, export, and trading of electricity. And what I'll get further on in this talk, I'll talk to what new categories of licensing are required. But if we look at this, what I was saying here about this insertion of Section 2A, it's just to take out certain provisions of certain activities from the Act, and that's sorry, I just had to shut. That is really taking out some of the categories that are sitting in the current exemption schedule. So the regulator, what has happened, if I look at the powers of the regulator of NERSA have actually been expanded under this act, which is good. And the regulator is also and there's also a lot of clarification in this legislation to take certain activities away from the minister, which was the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy in South Africa, and move it across to the regulator where it is more appropriately positioned. So if we look at if what I'm saying here in the amendments to Section 4 of the Act, the new provisions inserted, as I say, to give effect really to the Eskom unbundling as envisaged by the Department of Public Enterprises, which has traditionally been the Eskom shareholder, the national utility shareholder, and it's expanding the scope of licensable activities from those that I mentioned earlier to include market operation and system operation. The market operator will obviously run effectively the market under the market code, and the system operator is currently one of the Eskom, the NTCSA divisions, if I can call it that, and has always been part of the Eskom transmission division, but this is being formalized and is now a licensable activity. The market operation, there's currently, and we'll talk to this a little bit later, but there's a market code which is currently going through a consultation process in South Africa, a very extensive series of workshops being run by the market operator. And although the market operator and the system operator are not yet licensed as the NTCSA, the National Transmission Company of South Africa, the new transmission entity, no doubt that will happen as soon as the effective date of the amendments to the ERA are known. So could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so there are also amendments in the ERA in the Amendment Act to definitions of prices and tariffs, and these are mainly before under the and I mean it's quite technical amendments, but the existing Electricity Regulation Act has the same definition for both prices and tariffs. And what the Amendment Act seeks to do is to change the definition so that tariffs are those which include just the regulated tariffs by NERSA, the regulator, and prices are those which are charged by, for example, distributors like local authorities, which includes subsidies, surcharges, and those types of costs and levies that local authorities are entitled to charge under municipal legislation and the Constitution. So there is this distinction drawn, but the way that it flows through under the Act is that NERSA still has, under licensing conditions, the ability to set or approve both categories, so both prices and tariffs. So there is still a degree of interplay in what the regulator is entitled to do under the licensing conditions that it sets for licensed entities, including distributors. So also what's happened is that the dispute resolution provisions have been expanded under the Act. And one of the major changes is that arbitration has now been included as well. There are provisions for dispute resolution under the Act, which, as I say, have now been expanded. There are also provisions for dispute resolution under the very, very comprehensive suite of code documents, which regulate both the transmission and distribution industries. And so they all have to be read together. The other thing that's interesting about the South African system is that the codes, which are highly technical documents, well thought out, very comprehensively, very, very comprehensive documents, are incorporated into the license conditions of licensed transmitter, being the NTCSA, and the various distributors. In South Africa, the distributors at the moment are the Eskom distribution division, and the municipalities which are licensed to distribute electricity to their customers. There are a couple of private distributors, but this is much more by way of exception than the rule. Next slide, please. So the amendments that I've referred to in sections 4 and 6 are consequential amendments. They're just tightening up aspects of the Electricity Regulation Act, which has been in play, as we know, for almost 20 years. So, you know, the legislature took the opportunity just to correct the act, in addition to bringing into effect the wide-ranging reforms that are contemplated to the South African electricity supply industry. But importantly, the amendments to Section 7 are expanding the scope of licensable activities, as I said, to include market operation and system operation. And these, as I said, are activities that the NTCSA, the new transmitter, will be effecting. Then also importantly, and this was to kind of correct a situation where certain activities which were ostensibly performed by licensees under the Act were in fact subcontracted to others. The amendments allow certain license holders to do this. So, for example, if municipal distributors want to subcontract maintenance or operation of distribution facilities, they can, if they're allowed to do so in their license conditions. Next slide, please. I think it's the one before. Yeah, that one. So the section 9 was always the section in the ERA, in the existing act, which allows registration. And this is in terms of the exemption schedule that I've spoken to. So what's happened here is that in section 9, there's been an expansion of the section. And what's happened here is that registrants under the exemption schedule, so the exemption schedule under most circumstances requires registration, not licensing. But there was a sense that registrants weren't required to comply with the codes that I've referred to, the transmission and distribution network codes. I believe that that registrants were always required to comply with codes, because there was a conditionality attributed to the exemptions that said that in qualifying for the exemption, the activity had to be code compliant. But just, I think, belts and braces, there's been insertion of sections which ensure that registrants must comply with technical codes and together with the payment of fees. Next slide, please. I think we're still on the existing slide. Yeah, thank you. So section 10 is the section in the ERA which deals with the requirements for an application to the regulator for licensing. And just go back maybe one slide. Thank you. So what it's been amended to include the new licensable activities of market operation and system operation. And there's been a consequential amendment to the section to deal with pricing. And the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy has been substituted with the regulator. And this is just with regard to the ancillary provisions that the regulator may ask for in complying with in assessing a license application. So what's really happened here is that section 10 of the Act is a section that one goes to when looking at what needs to be submitted to NERSA in applying for currently either a generation, distribution, transmission license, an export, import and export license, or a trading license. And so these are just they're just amendments to bring the section into line with the rest of the amendments being made to the Act. Then section 11 is and there are a couple of sections here, sections 11, 12, and I think 13. These are to do with the the publication, this is the consultation process on license applications in South Africa. So what happens is that in the South African licensing regime, one applies for a license with the regulator, submits an application form. The licensing goes through the initial phases of the regulatory assessment, the confidentiality assessments, the various other things. And once the license gets to a certain stage, the regulator says to the applicant, please go ahead and publish this in national newspapers and put up hard copies of the actual license application, redacted for confidentiality in terms of applicable legislation in South Africa. So sections 11 and 12 and 13, which we'll get to shortly, are the existing provisions within the ERA as it stands, which deal with this publication and the whole the process leading to public consultation on these licenses. So the issue with the existing sections in the Act is that although they provide timelines, it's become quite difficult to get. There haven't been specific dates within these sections which hold the regulator to assessments of licenses within a specified time frame. If you start reading the sections together, so what the amendments are trying to do here is to provide clarity on exactly how these licenses must be advertised. And the timelines within which the regulator objections must be may be given to these license applications, and the timelines within which the regulator must assess the objections and may ask for further information and then grant the licenses. What's really clear, sorry, next slide please, because this will show up in sections 12 and 13, is that as you also see in section 13, that there was a licensing approval period or refusal period of 120 days in the existing ERA, but this was only really once objections had been closed out or the regulator had assessed all the information it required. There's currently no obligation on the regulator, on NERSA, to call for all of the information it requires within a certain period. So what has happened in the past is that certain of these license applications have taken ages and ages to assess. The idea behind these amendments is to pull the 120-day period to 60 days and to run that 60-day period from the date that objections are closed out and from the date that all information is given to the regulator. Unfortunately, I think there's a glitch here because the regulator still doesn't have a timeline in the ERA amendment where it has to call for certain information within a certain time period. So, and we've discussed the amendment to section 14. In the interest of time, I'm aware that that this is quite a big presentation, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Please, next slide. So, section 15 is a section in the Act, in the ERA, that deals with license conditions. And this is, as I said before, it's under section 15 that the regulator gets to regulate licensees. So there are amendments to the tariff and pricing approvals. There is now, the regulator can set, or in the license conditions can include conditionality around the setting or approval of tariffs. And there's been some tweaking of the wording around the rates of return commensurate with risk. There's nothing material there. But what is clear is that licensees can't charge customers tariffs other than the tariffs set or approved by the regulator. So, but the big exception to this is the new section 15.4, which for prices that arise from a competitive market are no longer subject to regulation under the license conditions of licensees and the direct supply agreements. Now, direct supply agreements are bilateral agreements. It's quite technical, but this excludes trading where the trader is a customer. and sales to licensed organs of state. So what's going to be very interesting in the context of the new competitive wholesale market in South Africa that's envisaged to come into operation, hopefully in 2026, is to see what the knock-on effect of these amendments to Section 15 relating to pricing are when it comes to procurement of power from a wholesale market, but where there are certain entities which are participants in that market, which are still regulated as to pricing and tariffs under their license conditions. So the South African regulator is going to have quite a big job ahead of it to understand in the whole process of tariff reform that is facing the country, and in the opening up of the markets to envisage, this competitive wholesale market, exactly how the interplay between the regulated tariff setting and the non-regulated tariff setting works. And it's an exciting space, but it is going to require a whole lot of unpacking of exactly how the situation, how it works at the moment and how it should work in the future. Just with regard to the market code in this regard, the market code, the comments on the market code, as I say, has been going through a big consultation process run by the market operator for a number of months now. It's gone through 10 different workshops. Comments on the market code are due by the 14th of October, so within 14 days effectively from now. And after the market operator, the NTCSA, has looked at the comments on the code, it's envisaged that the code will be redrafted and then put before the regulator for the regulator's approval. So Section 16 looks like a consequential amendment, and it is, but the regulator, what has happened in the past is that the ERA has prescribed that the minister will prescribe procedures for license condition modification, and this has never happened. There's been this amendment to the section to say that the regulator can now prescribe the procedures for license condition modification. And this, I think, is really going to help the regulator, because we've had licenses in position for decades now, and because there hasn't been a procedure for license condition modification, the regulator has felt that it's constrained and has not been able to amend license conditions. So we have some licenses in South Africa which are not ideal, specifically a number of the distribution licenses which are issued to municipalities are styled as temporary distribution licenses, and some of them even refer to the act which preceded the Electricity Regulation Act of 2006. So they're hopelessly out of date, and hopefully this amendment will allow the regulator to correctly enforce, well, firstly to set license conditions and then to enforce them. So also what happens in Section 17 is, because, as I said, a lot of most of the generation in South Africa is currently taking place, well, not most of it. Most of the generation in South Africa is currently still via Eskom generation. But what has happened with the opening up of the market, certainly in the bilateral space, and that is the willing buyer, willing seller type of undertaking that has been happening for quite some time now. So most of that generation for private IPPs is taking place under Schedule 2 of the ERA. And this new Section 17A is pulling in provisions that are seated in the schedule into the main body of the Act now. I think it's just for regulatory certainty. So entitling the regulator to vary or suspend, deregister or revoke registrations. Next slide, please. So amendments to Section 21. Now, this goes to a lot of what Joshua was saying, and Brian had said before him about the open access type provisions of legislation throughout in the continent. So the amendments to Section 21 deal with non-discriminatory access, and what I'd like to say about this is that it's very much aligned to what Joshua was saying is happening in Zambia. So what the amendments to Section 21 are bolstering the non-discriminatory access provisions of the Act, which are incredibly strong in any event. We have in South Africa, a very still monopolistic electricity supply industry. We have, you know, I don't know what the percentage is, but a large majority of the generation in South Africa is still through Eskom generation. And if you look at a vertically integrated utility like Eskom, which has generation distribution and now through a separate company, but still as a subsidiary of Eskom Holdings, the NTCSA, you have the ability to ensure that that things are aligned in the direction of Eskom itself. So the amendments to Section 21 take what was previously a strong framework for non-discriminatory access and bolster it even more. There are also consequential amendments further along in the amendment bill, which further provide that the transmission entity, the NTCSA, has to give non-discriminatory access. This is also embedded throughout the various grid code and distribution code documents, this non-discriminatory access provision. And similarly to what Joshua was explaining about in the Zambian context, South Africa has also got an incredibly constrained transmission grid. And whilst we're very fortunate in this country that, you know, there are a lot of independent power producers and finance houses that are prepared to build generation capacity, one of the burning issues at the moment is access to the transmission network. So this is definitely a choke point, and it is one of the biggest things that IPPs are dealing with in the country. The provisions in South Africa have been non-discriminatory access based on also what Joshua was referring to on a traditionally first come first served basis. But Eskom has, in the course of the last year and a half odd, been updating a suite of documents that are called the Interim Grid Capacity Allocation Rules, which, and the acronym, because we love the acronyms, is ICGA. And what they've done is they've segued slightly so that the non-discriminatory access provisions are no longer first come, first served, because there was a thought that there was what was referred to as capacity hogging or grid capacity hogging. And so it's moved across to something called first ready, first served. And the idea is that generation facilities or projects which are most ready to connect to the grid are the ones that are given a priority. I think this is an admirable concept in that it will serve to bring generation capacity online more quickly. The difficulty is, however, that in my own view, this is not aligned yet to the provisions of the various code documents, which are incorporated into the license conditions of the transmitter and of the distribution entities, in that the codes haven't been updated. So you've got a set of rules which are saying one thing, but a set of codes that are saying another. And the codes, as far as I'm concerned, are the important documents because they're incorporated into the license conditions. And breach of the codes then triggers a breach of licenses, which triggers a breach effectively of the Act itself. So there's work to be done in South Africa in consulting on the grid capacity allocation rules, aligning them with the codes, and this is the function of the regulator, not of the utility, because there's also a perception that the utility will act in such a way as to favor itself potentially. So the amendments, as I say, to Section 21 bolster the non-discriminatory access provisions of the Act. Next slide, please. I think that I'm not seeing the next slide. Oh, there we go. So as I said earlier, the Section 30 changes are that arbitration is now included as well. Section 34 amendments are possibly the one of the biggest sets of amendments to the ERA. And Brian or Josephat, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time here, but if I'm give me a steer if I'm running out, please. But we haven't. I think this is the last of the major sections. So the amendments to Section 34 are really, really critical in the South African electricity supply context. And these amendments are the ones that are to give rise to the competitive electricity wholesale market, which is envisaged by this Act. Also, so the traditional Section 34 in South Africa was, if you looked at national procurement programs in terms of which the Minister of, back in the day, Mineral Resources and Energy was procuring power under the Integrated Resource Plan of South Africa, he would do it or she would do it by way of a Section 34 determination. And a Section 34 determination pulled on power if that was seated under the IPP and allocated and issued a determination saying that, that power would be subject to a procurement program in terms of which a certain amount of energy from certain types of technology would be bought by, generally speaking, Eskom. Eskom's always been the buyer, and it would be sold. The procurement process would be run through the South African IPP procurement office. There have been huge amendments to Section 34. Could we have the next slide, please? So one of the major amendments before that slide comes on is, I've got 15 more minutes. Thank you very much. Then I can slow down and not charge like a wounded buffalo. So what has happened, and this was subject to intense debate during the NEDLAC process in South Africa, and NEDLAC is the stakeholder engagement forum following normal public consultation. It is an engagement forum in terms under the NEDLAC Act, where government, communities, labor, and business sit and debate legislation that has a social, economic, labor type impact. And obviously this act was one of those major pieces of legislation. So what has happened under Section 34 in a nutshell, because otherwise you've got to read this section and you've got to look at what's been taken out and what's been put in and try and analyze it, is that there are a couple of amendments that enforce effectively the power of the minister to do things that he or she would not have been able to in the past. And one of them that is critically important here is that the minister under the existing Electricity Regulation Act has to get the concurrence of NERSA before a Section 34 determination, which pulls on the energy allocated under the Integrated Resource Plan, is subject to a national procurement program. And for example, a number of years ago, there was a nuclear ministerial determination. There was a determination for the procurement of, I think it was 9.6 gigawatts of nuclear energy. And what happened during that process is that the regulator concurred with the minister's determination, but didn't follow due process. And so the minister and the regulator and various other entities were taken to court, and the determination was set aside because of the wording, and it is the change of one word in the Act. The current Section 34 of the ERA of the Electricity Regulation Act says that the minister must, in consultation with the regulator, determine certain things. Now, what that word has been changed to after. So, minister can now determine after consultation with NERSA and with the Minister of Finance that certain categories of that electricity needs to be procured. It's an incredibly important distinction from the perspective of the powers of the minister under this Act. What Section 34 also does is it enlarges the scope of the energy to be procured by the minister. It was a technical definition, which was new generation capacity, which is defined in some in regulations, but it has enlarged the scope of what the minister can go on effectively a national procurement program to electricity itself, to new generation capacity, which as we know is different to electricity. And then it also, quite importantly, I think, expands the scope of what the minister can procure to electricity infrastructure projects. So transmission equipment, which I think is quite an exciting development, because if we understand that there is one of the biggest constraints to secure electricity supply in the continent is the state of the grids, the national networks, including distribution and transmission, then we understand that money has to be thrown in that direction and that the grid has to be built up. And one of the ways in which this can happen is that the minister in South Africa can now procure effectively grid infrastructure under Section 34 determinations. There's a whole bunch of consequential amendments to Section 34 as well, some of which I personally don't believe. I think that this, I was saying earlier that the powers of the regulator have been enhanced and enforced through these amendments. I think that Section 34 amendments have given the minister a lot more power. And they've taken away the wording that was in the existing Section 34 relating to procurement processes that were fair, transparent, all of those things being deleted. Minister can only apparently procure power for the purpose of security of supply, energy security, but there's also kind of iffy wording that talks to in the interests of national security. So whereas before it was there was wording, and I'm just trying to see if I've got it in here, which spoke to ensuring long-term sustainability of supply. Now there's wording that's been introduced that talks to optimal supply and becomes very subjective. So Section 34 is an important section. The minister, next slide, please. The minister is obliged to take into consideration the provisions of the integrated resource plan. Sorry, this is all, I've got a lot of stuff in here about, sorry, next slide, please. The minister is bound to consider the integrated resource plan, which is really good, but the issue is that the integrated resource plan can be moved away from by the minister, following consultation, or if there's a national emergency. So there's very, very subjective wording coming in here. The issue is that the amendments to the Electricity Regulation Act are primarily focused on bringing about a competitive market, a wholesale electricity market that bolsters the current kind of bilateral market that is in place, where independent power producers and traders sell to customers on a willing buyer basis. The concern that some commentators have about Section 34 is that it's not clear how ministerial determinations procuring energy are going to work going forward, if they're purely designed to supplement that which is procured in the market, or if they're going to be completely in addition to the market. So there's a concern that that there could be procurement which the market would otherwise, which the market doesn't, or the industry doesn't need. So it's, that's just an overriding. It's something that I don't think has been cleared out completely in the Amendment Act. The other amendments that have come into the Act are then also seated, a lot of them, in Section 34. Next slide, please. And Section 34 deals with the so this talks to the unbundling effectively of Eskom and the NTCSA, which is the old Eskom transmission division. It deals with, so next slide, it deals with the system operation, market operation, central purchasing agency, and yes, so I haven't got them set out here, but it deals with system operation with the NTCSA as a system operator, as a market operator, as a the transmission entity, and as the central purchasing agency. So, and it prescribes certain activities that each of these entities functions are required to perform. As we know from previous other provisions of this Amendment Act, the system operator and the market operator are required to be licensed. They are not yet licensed. In late last year, the NTCSA was awarded a transmission license, a trading license, and an import and export license. So there are certain activities which are currently licensed by the licensed, not by NERSA, and the NTCSA is licensed, but it needs more in order to achieve the objectives of this act. And then next slide. Okay, so that would then bring it to the end of their presentation. But the other things that let me think about what I've missed in this presentation here. So the effect of this Amendment Act is to bring about is to tighten up the ERA, to bring into effect the market, the wholesale market, which is now a subject of the market code discussions, the workshops. And to make consequential amendments. The concern and to tighten up, the access provisions as well that Joshua had referred to earlier in his presentation regarding this Zambian networks. I don't think that the amendments are perfect. I think that they move in the right direction. I think there's still a degree of uncertainty, as I said, about what the powers of the minister are. And in relation to the functioning of the wholesale market, because the market that is envisaged in South Africa is a hybrid market. It is not, so it is in the move away from the single buyer model through to the central purchasing agency being effectively what the single buyer was, and for the operation of the market, what is not clear from this act is what the interplay is and what the role of government is. And Section 34, I don't think is tight enough to stipulate exactly where government, in the form of the minister through ministerial determination, should be stepping in and procuring energy and where not. The other thing is that it is envisaged that the central purchasing agency, Eskom, has traditionally been the buyer under national procurement under ministerial determinations in South Africa. And it is envisaged that the central purchasing agency will be the buyer, generally in people's minds, but it is not clearly stipulated in this act. It's stipulated that the central purchasing agency will be the buyer for what is referred to as legacy, independent legacy contracts, which is the old Section 34 contracts, Section 34 IPP contracts, but there's no clarity given as to the role of the central purchasing agency going forward for national procurement programs. So, I mean, on a wild interpretation of Section 34, the minister could actually assign a buyer as some, and the procurer. The minister isn't bound to use the IPP procurement office that's been running South African REAP and other national procurement programs, and isn't obliged to assign the NTCSA central purchasing agency as the buyer. So there's wiggle room, but there's also an acknowledgement that the state has an obligation to ensure security of supply. So I think that what is happening is that South Africa is finding its feet. It's moving across to this market. It is acknowledged that it needs to move across to this market. South Africa's had years of load shedding, as has, I think, the rest of the continent. It's been ameliorated in the recent past. We've had a couple of months of no load shedding, but we had severe load shedding for a long time. And what has happened is that there's a lot of private generation that has come onto the grid. This is behind the meter generation, but in the form of a lot of households and small businesses are putting rooftop PV onto their roofs, and there are a lot of private plants, bigger plants that have been constructed and are connected and are wheeling energy across the grid to honor bilateral power purchase agreements. In addition to the energy procured under the various rounds of national procurement issued, under Section 34 determinations, in addition to the Eskom generation. The Eskom generation fleet is aging. It's a coal-based fleet. It is, it's had a lot of, there's been, I think it's better in the recent past, but it was subject to poor maintenance and a lot of downtime with a poor energy availability factor for a number of years, which is improving. Certainly with regard to South African manufacturing, the manufacturers have got to meet certain green targets. They have to, if they're exporting into Europe, they have to meet the CBAM obligations. So there's a huge drive to procure renewable energy. And that is driving, apart from, so we've had load shedding, we've had various things which have been driving the move to private procurement of power. The private procurement of power is unlikely to go away. It will probably, the bilaterals will coexist with the wholesale electricity market, which is envisaged by the market code. And there's this move towards this competitive market. But there's a lot of regulatory interaction and intervention that's required to make that happen. And I could carry on talking about this all day, but I'm going to stop here.
So thank you so much for the lovely presentation. It was really in-depth and in detail.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think there's a question from the Q&A section, which says, is Eskom the only player that is allowed to export electricity outside of South Africa, or does the new regulation allow for licensed traders to be able to export power?
So that's a very, do you mind if I take that question right now, or is there another one you also wanted to ask?
No, please. I just picked it straight from the Q&A.
Wonderful. So that's actually, it's actually incredibly fortuitous that question is coming up now, because the current, even the ERA pre-amendment allows, if licensed, for import and export of electricity. Eskom is currently the only licensed exporter of electricity in South Africa, but there is another applicant which has put its import-export application before the regulator in South Africa, and has gone very, very far down the process. In fact, there's a NERSA meeting tomorrow to discuss, amongst other things, this application, and that applicant is GreenCo. So GreenCo has got an import-export application before the regulator, which is very far advanced in the process, and hopefully this will be approved in the very short, in the near term. There are a lot of entities in South Africa watching this application, because in order to get energy into or out of South Africa, you're going to need two things. Well, actually, maybe not always, but you will probably need a trading license, and you'll probably need an import-export license. And because of the positioning of GreenCo as a SAP member, and with its operations throughout the continent, it has, as I say, it's far down the process. At the moment, it is only Eskom, but GreenCo has been working very closely with Eskom in order to formalize the procedural aspects of how to get power in and out of the country. So that's a very long way of saying, yes, it is only Eskom, but they, watch the space, because it looks like others are coming.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Sue.
It's my absolute pleasure. And then, so I'll just look at if there are any questions, I'll just respond to them in the Q&A.
Yes, lovely. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we are going to move to the second section. I mean, the last section of our presentations today. and it's going to cover the Zimbabwean market. And yeah, this moving my slides. Okay, great. Yeah, so the last part is going to talk about the permits and licenses for standardized solar. And then it's going to flow on from there. And we have an expert presenter from there as well. Her name is Sue Brighton, and Sue is one of the senior partners at Gill and Godlonton and Gerrans, and has been a partner in the firm for over 30 years. She holds and BL and LLB in honors from the University of Zimbabwe and LIM from Cambridge University. Sue has a wealth of experience relating to a wide range of transactions, particularly in relation to infrastructure projects, inward investment and structuring, and securitization. Pardon my pronunciation. Yeah, so Sue is recognized as a leading lawyer, band one by Chambers Global, and she has acted for a wide range of corporate clients, including Nedbank, Standard Bank for SA, and Standard Chartered Bank, and Zimbabwe Power Corporation, that's ZPC, Röhrs, and let's just say she has an incredible amount of experience. And of course, I'll leave Sue to take us through the rest of the presentation. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, and we're going to be responding as the presentations are ongoing. And yeah, thank you so much. And Sue, over to you. Thank you, by the way, for making time to join us.
Great. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My apologies, I've not been able to join the whole session, so I will rely on the convener to interrupt me if there are any issues that have been raised previously and need to be addressed in this presentation. In this presentation, I'm not dealing with standard licensing issues in terms of the Electricity Act and the like, because as you can see from the brief bio that was posted, I'm looking at development of a solar project in a much wider context, looking at land issues, financing issues, and the like, not simply the electricity regulations. So if we move on to the first slide, we will deal with the biggest issue that I see for developers, which is actually the money. There's no doubt Zimbabwe's got the land. There's no doubt Zimbabwe has the perfect climate, certainly talking about solar. But looking at the projects we see, it is the money. And those of you who are sitting in Zimbabwe today will have seen changes in monetary policy which were brought about on Friday. It's those unexpected changes in monetary policy that make the financing of these projects often quite difficult. So when we are asked to advise on a project, first thing is, where is the money going to come from and how is the project going to be structured? Therefore, the first slide deals with investment licenses. Zimbabwe has a very simple but very strict exchange control environment, which is this: no person who is resident outside Zimbabwe can own a Zimbabwe company without exchange control approval. Exchange control approval is also needed for inward investment and payment of loan capital. Therefore, to start a project where money is going to come from outside, and that is often where we see the financing being sourced, an investment license issued by AfIDA is the first thing to do. I accept that the license fees charged by AfIDA are high, but at least if a developer has the AfIDA application ready, the time period to get AfIDA approval is very short. And this would be a critical step in the funding and in keeping the investors happy. And also developers would want to see their benefit down the line, potentially in a structure offshore. So due to Zimbabwe's exchange control restrictions, should you establish a successful project and you then wish to sell your successful project to a funder or a large owner of projects externally, you've then got to get exchange control approval if you do not get your ZEDA license in the beginning. So you can see I've put this as the first slide because I consider it vital to a project development, and it doesn't take a lot of homework on the part of the developer, and certainly worth doing in the beginning. You will see a lot of what ZEDA requires here is exactly the same as you have done or will be doing during your development of your project in order to get your generation license. Could we move on to the next slide? This sets out the balance of the requirements to get your ZEDA license. And once again, it is duplicating a lot of what is there for your generation license. So if you start on your project, run your two license applications side by side. It doesn't mean you submit them simultaneously, but do your homework at the same time. Please don't reinvent the wheel. Thanks. Moving along to the next license that is needed. Right. You need an environmental permit in order to get a generation license. Now, whilst I accept that compared to a thermal project, the environmental impact of solar or wind is minimal, these EMA permits have got to be obtained. Again, not a difficult permit to get, but it's necessary to jump through the hoops. What puts off a lot of developers is the cost of this EMA permit. You will see that the licensing fee is 0.8 to 1.2% of the project. So you have two issues here. One is the actual cost. The other is negotiate when that's going to be paid so that you don't end up with a cash flow issue. Your other issue here is to negotiate with EMA as to the currency in which you're going to pay this. There is no doubt that you have a right to pay this in ZiG. But as I say, it is a matter of negotiation with EMA to make sure that this payment is not going to be such a financial burden on your project that it's a non-starter. So this again is more homework that needs to be done in the beginning. Go and talk to EMA, go and see what they're prepared to do for you in order to make your project work. Doing the environmental impact assessment report is not a lot of work. There's plenty of people in the market who are doing these reports, and again, negotiate the fee for doing that so that the cost of this report is cost effective for your project. Thanks. Moving to the next slide, please. This is simply more on the permit that you need. As you see, EMA is obliged to review and provide you response within 60 days, failing which your project is deemed to be approved. This is a very nice piece of legislation, as it puts time pressure on EMA and means that your project is not held up by the EMA certificate. Just an aside here, please, when you get your various certificates, can you check that the names on the certificates are all the same? It is not unusual to see typographical errors on certificates. And whilst it may not be a problem, it becomes a problem further down the line. So please note to self, double check the names on the licenses that you obtain. Moving along. So next thing, and where you would have normally start, is your generation license. Please note that the threshold for a generation license is low, and I suspect that there are gen sets out there that are operating and don't know that they actually need a license. The licensing process is clear. Zero are proactive, submitting the paperwork and paperwork you need is clearly set out as to what the requirements are. The difficulties are, one, cost. Secondly, meeting the date when the board is going to sit. So again, starting by talking to Zero, taking your initial documentation with you, and finding out when the board is going to be able to consider your application is vital. Please note at the bottom of the slide, reference to proof of tax registration. Now, as much as we all hate it, registering with the new Zimra TAM system is simple. And I understand that you no longer need to have an actual fiscalized device. You can now obtain a virtual fiscalized device. Again, that is making it easier. If you can move on to the next slide, please. This is the difficult part of the slide. So it's technical capacity to complete the proposed project, your buyer and off-taker, and your proposed PPA. Quite apart from the interconnection point to the transmission system, but I suspect that a considerable number of developers will have tied projects. So the interconnection to the transmission system is often not the major point here. If you look at Zero's list of issued licenses, which it's not entirely up to date, but it gives a good indication. About 30% of the projects are projects which have licenses, and many of them we all know they've been around for years. They are not up and running, and one of the biggest problems is the PPA, the currency of the PPA. unless you can find onshore funding in a currency that is the same currency as your offtake is going to pay you, you are ending up with a disconnect from day one between currencies, which is why I started this presentation looking at the investment issues that have to be faced and looking now at PPA. So the critical problem is that your PPA may be USD based, but the law is quite clear that your off-taker can at any moment turn around and pay you in ZiG, which completely upsets your financing. Therefore, the way that projects go best is if there is a tied off-taker who needs the power. If they need the power, they will make sure that the developer is paid. Having said that, of course, your offtake may be facing exactly the same currency risk as you are facing. But one of the difficulties faced by the grid off-taker is their obligation to recover payment in ZiG, that to the extent that they cannot force their buyers, their retail customers, to pay them in USD, they have issues in paying any person with whom they have a PPA in USD. So I'm beginning to sound like a tired record on the currency issue, but those Zimbabwean developers who are online, I'm sure will understand how critical the currency issue is to any project. A lot of the other issues that a developer faces are similar in any jurisdiction, in that one has to comply with regulations to get a generation license, to connect into the grid, and so on. So that's why I'm stressing the currency issue here. Thank you. Move on from this. This slide again talks to one of the issues that we see as critical, which is a land use permit. Please note that this term land use permit is a generic term. It is not specific. If you Google land use permit for Zimbabwe, you will not find anything useful. Zimbabwe's land holding system has been fundamentally changed in the last 24 years. So the standard solar developer will be looking to use a fair amount of land. So I'm not talking here about rooftop solar. I'm talking about solar that is going to be based on the land. If you are doing that, what right have you got to develop your project? You would think this is simple. You are either dealing with the owner of the land or a person who leases the land. However, our land title system is now complex in that we are looking at government owning almost all of the land that does not form urban land. So let's break this down. If you are doing a development within the area of a town or a city, then either the that
I'm so sorry. I think there was a bit of breaking the network. Could you kindly go through that last part as well again?
Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of unstable connectivity going on. So I was wondering if you could just repeat that, the last part of what you just said. I think there's a bit of some technical challenges. I think Sue has dropped off. Oh, we've got Sue. We've got two Sues online, apparently. We've got Sue Brighton and Sue Rose. One presenting right now is Sue Rose, and I think she's probably just having some technical challenges.
Hello, are we back?
Oh yes, hello Sue. Hi. Bit of some network challenges, I'm guessing.
Yes. Okay. Can you tell me where it dropped off? Were we talking about land use?
Yes, talk about land permits and land use.
Okay. So forgive me if I'm repeating this due to the connectivity issue. So ideally, if you can develop in the area of a town or city, remember a lot of the smaller towns in Zimbabwe, the area that is governed by the town is much wider than the area that is actually developed. So if you can get into that area, your land use is simple. If you're not there and you're dealing with land outside of an urban area, you will find very few portions of land for which there are title deeds. Therefore, you need to look at whether there is an offer letter for the land, whether the person who has the offer letter can get a registered long lease for that piece of land, and therefore whether you can get a registered long sublease over that land. That's acquired land. So government owns all the land that's acquired during the land redistribution process, and it has very specific methods of allowing security of tenure for that land. It's a problem that project developers have all the time. So if it's not urban land, and if it's not land owned by government, then it is communal land. We are seeing more projects seeking to develop in communal land. Communal land is a difficult area to deal with security of tenure. The Rural District Council can enter into a lease arrangement for a portion of land, but you can't get security of tenure that a lender is going to want over that type of lease. Obviously, you've also got to be careful to ensure that there's proper consultation with the community and the community expectations properly handled. So there's plenty of land in communal areas that is ideal for particularly solar projects, but managing the relationship is it's hard work. What you then want ideally is to have your portion of land excised, taken out of the communal land. So you will know that there's pressure on government to allow land in the communal areas to be more commercially viable. But it is a sensitive issue. The president, however, has the ability to excise a specific area of land from the communal area and to grant a title deed. So if you can work on your project area being excised from the communal land, that is first prize to give you security of tenure. So that's the third type. We've got urban land, we've got land outside of the towns that belongs to government, we've got communal land. And then we have mining title. You will know are looking to develop major solar projects. And many of those mines have extensive mining claims. So you will see that a mine may have pegged mining claims way beyond the land that they will ever mine on. But as long as they have got those mining claims, a power project can be developed on those mining claims, provided all you are doing is supplying the mine. You can't use mining title to land to supply power into the grid. But it still is a very useful way of getting around the land use problems. And we have seen that funders are generally quite happy with mining title, provided they get a clean opinion on that mining title. Inevitably, there are a few nuances within mining title which need to be looked at. So just deviating slightly here to going back to the currency issues. The question that's been put is, can Africa GreenCo help with currency issue? Absolutely. Africa GreenCo and its ability to provide currency stabilization is hugely important in the development of projects in Zimbabwe and has been elsewhere. I've also been asked whether government implementation agreements help. Yes, government implementation agreements do help, but it's a matter of what security those implementation agreements are actually going to give. I'm going to go off a tangent here. You recall we started looking at, in this presentation with investment licenses. So one of the things you can do as part of your investment license structuring is have your project run through a BIPA country. So that's a country with a bilateral investment protection agreement with Zimbabwe. History relates that those portions of land which were owned by companies which had parent companies in BIPA countries, those companies largely been able to retain their land. So government does have respect for its bilateral investment protection agreements. It's not absolute, but it's better than nothing. And likewise, if you do get a government implementation agreement or a government support agreement, that's further, it puts you a step ahead of another developer. It gives you some protection. It makes funders more likely to talk to you than to talk to the next person who comes to them with a project for Zimbabwe. So once again, you see that we are talking about, and this slide actually has both the big issues in it, land use and investment. In the Zimbabwe context, I see generation license, grid connection, water extraction if you need it, environmental impact assessment. These are easy. So that's why it's worth looking at the Zero site. Of the 150 odd licenses they've granted, why is it that so many of them are not actually generating power? And I would suggest the problem is money. It's the Z word puts off international investors, although we are getting better. It's not as much of a disadvantage as it was. We have to address currency stability, remittability of currency, and land use. If you can address those three hurdles in the beginning, then you are well on your way to having a viable project. Moving, if we can move along to the next slide. Yeah, if we can skip this one and move on to the next one. So I've skipped through grid connection because actually most of the projects we're seeing that are commercially viable are tied projects. And that does seem to be the way to go at the moment. And there's certainly a demand from both industry and more particularly the mining sector to make sure that's right. This slide here talks of the water extraction permit. It's not usually a problem. You wouldn't think of a project needing a water extraction permit, but just be careful. Make sure that if you need water, and you're going to need water for some part of your project, that the water extraction permit is in place, or the person who is supplying your water has a water extraction permit, so you don't run into that problem. Thanks. Next slide. Okay. A power plant is a factory. The Factories and Works legislation is very old. Just look at the date on the general regulations, it's 1976. So it's the regulations, not particularly prescriptive, they're kind of common sense, but look at whether you are going to be a factory and whether you need a Factories and Works permit. And the issue on factories is reporting any accident that occurs. So you will see that the definition of a factory includes the generation of electricity. I suspect that a fair number of licensees who are generating don't have their factories and works permits. You don't want to be caught with this, so make sure that you look into this when you're starting. Thanks. Moving along. Okay, that's just the licensing fee on a factory's permit. We move to the next slide. Yeah. For a plant to be established, whether it's solar, wind, or anything else, you need to have the correct planning permission and a development permit in order to construct your generation facility, whatever it is. Please note that it's different if you are supplying a mine, because if you're supplying a mine, you can avoid having to apply for planning permission yourself. It is the mine that files what's known as a mine plan with the Ministry of Mines. The mine plan is telling the mining commissioner what the mining entity is going to be building in the next 6 months or year or whatever. So your plant is simply included in the mine plan, and you do not have to go through the whole planning process that you have to do otherwise if you are developing in urban areas, if you're developing in farming areas, or if you are developing in communal land. So again, a very nice shortcut if you can do a project supplying a mine. Thank you. If you can move on. Okay. So I've touched on land use already. Please have a look at these 3 pieces of legislation. The Land Commission Act and the Communal Lands Act are both very simple pieces of legislation, definitely worth looking at. Mines and Minerals Act, that provision I've talked about earlier, is somewhat different. But you're not going to raise money if you don't have secure land use. So, urban land, get a lease, get a registered long lease. Outside non-urban land, a joint venture approved by Ministry of Agriculture is an option, but try and get a registered long lease. Communal land, lease, try and get preferably the land excised out of the communal land. Mines, it's pleasure. Check the duration of their mining claim or their mining lease, enter into an agreement with the mine. It's not actually a lease as such. It looks like a lease, it sounds like a lease, but it's not a lease. And your financiers will probably be happy. So before you spend too much money on any project, make sure you know what your land use problem is. Thanks. Moving along. I am not going to talk to the reporting obligations under all these acts, and I ask that the slides just run through here. There are obvious reporting obligations in terms of all the legislation. It's not onerous. It's just a matter of knowing what they are and making sure that you don't miss the deadlines. So, Josephat, if you can please just run through the slides. Next slide, please. Next, please. Thanks very much. As time is short, as I say, I'm not speaking to those, but happy to take any questions rising.
All right, thank you so much, Sue. I think there's some questions which are being thrown into the chat. Okay, I think you can speak to those as well. You can probably just respond from there. But in the interest of time, I think we're looking at about 12 minutes remaining. I think we still have some questions in the Q&A, and I believe those are being responded to. Perhaps while we respond to those questions in the background as well, we could have a few closing remarks from our presenters as we wind down to the end of our presentation, to the end of this session of our webinars. I will give Brian to give some closing remarks.
Thank you, Josephat, and thank you for the interactions on the question and answers. We've received quite a lot of questions, and I hope we've been able to answer your questions. But we're also appreciative of our presenters who have joined us from outside GreenCo. We appreciate your availability to participate in this webinar. In terms of just my closing remarks, I'll just add, I think some of the points Sue Brighton has just added in relation to just doing things at the right time. They may not necessarily be very onerous when you start early, but if you leave them to the end when you have financiers waiting and they put them as we can only appear as if they are dragging their feet and holding back your project because you've come right at the end and you need these approvals very quickly. So it's always important to plan ahead, do your due diligence, understand the environment you're working in, and get your processes. One point that Sue just highlighted, the issues of land tenure issues. Those are things that are not unique to Zimbabwe. We have those also in Zambia, where there's a difference between state land and customary land, how you acquire the approvals and the steps you have to go through, community engagement. But those are things that can be managed well with time if you start early and to engage the necessary people in the process. So in terms of the Zambian sector that we looked at earlier, the market is open for business. There are traders such as GreenCo who are able to get into arrangements with potential developers to be able to develop projects, because the private sector now has a window of opportunity to get into the development of projects. So we really appreciate your time, and we hope these sessions are helpful to get you to understand some of the procedures within the countries that we have at least represented by the presenters today. Joshua, I'll invite you to just also say something before we get to Suro and Roberts, Brighton, sorry, at the end. Joshua?
Thanks, Brian. So just confirm, are you able to get me?
Yes, we can get you. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks very much. And it was definitely an insightful session looking at the 3 different countries, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. And I think the key theme here is that we're kind of all going through certain challenges, the power deficit, but with a law kind of responding to that and seeing how it can be accommodated to going forward. I was very much interested.
Sorry, Joshua. Did we just lose you there?
Try to not say
Oh,
anything.
sorry, Joshua. We missed a few seconds of your presentation.
Sorry, just telling me that I think the point I was saying is most of the changes going on are kind of similar in the various countries. So there's room, I think, for us to kind of pick up what's working in other countries and what's not working to see how can be done. But for the IPPs and what we usually recommend for our clients, I think that's the issue of trying to start this thing early and having a number of things in place. What is required in a jurisdiction, you've gone to the prior permit, which you need to go, who you need to talk to. Even before you submit an application, most regulators, I think, are more than happy to accommodate you, to hear you explain to them your challenges. They also explain to you what how they've gone about with it, and that kind of definitely helps even before you meet the your financiers. So having that in place is always I think recommended for any project, so that come implementation it's kind of a smooth light. So for me, Brian, I think that would be my recommendation and my last points to add.
Thank you very much, Joshua. We appreciate it. Sue, Rose, would you be able to give also some closing remarks? And if there's any question maybe you've seen that needed a last comment, please do take the opportunity.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I think it's been a very interesting to hear what's going on in other countries, and I think that the challenges we are not facing unique challenges. So an alignment would be really wonderful, and I think there's learning to be had in the region. I think it's exciting times. I think that there are huge opportunities to solve these problems and to get electricity supply out to those who need it, and to grow the economies of in the region. So I think we need to keep up to speed with the developments and weigh in and assist each other where necessary. And thank you to GreenCo for this for today, and thank you to co-presenters for very insightful and interesting presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That is at least a very clear picture that we're getting, that the developments in the region are not different, and we all seem to be facing similar challenges. Sue Roberts, would you also give us your closing remarks?
To echo what my co-presenters have said, which is thank you to GreenCo for all you are doing in the region. It helps developers know that there is this level of interaction and a way forward. So I think it's a huge improvement on where we were 3 or 4 years ago. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sue. And just to let our attendants know, we will share the link to the webinar for those that have attended. We also noted that some were requesting for the link to the previous one. So we'll do that as well, just to give you, you know, an opportunity to see what was discussed, and also to build that from today's. Our next webinar will be at the end of October, and we'll be discussing financial modeling, bank financing for renewable energy for independent power producers. So that is a very critical point. Once you dealt with your project finance aspect of putting your project together, you're dealing with your regulatory aspects. How do you actually deal with the financial modeling? How do you factor in the costs that go into building up your tariff, into getting in to the point of negotiating with your off-taker or your customer, what the costs will be, the inputs related to wheeling and so on. All those costs go in. Licensing fees have to be factored in, and has been noted, also exchange risks are things that will go into that thought process. So exciting presentations we're going to have from experienced people that have actually developed and financed projects, as we had today also from our presenters, people who've actually worked on projects within the region. We also have similar experts who've dealt with financial modeling, financing aspects for renewable projects, particularly within the Southern African region.